So our basic philosophy is, obviously that we help. The goal is always amongst all departments to increase our clients' self-sufficiency, and so that's certainly aligns with the mission of education. I believe very strongly and have lots of arguments with, Department of Social Services, particularly, that investing in education in the long run will pay pay off for all of our students. It's really tough for a lot of our students, especially like 18-year-olds. They have a lot of financial burden and feel obligated to help the family financially. So I will try and argue and do what I can to help them get benefits so that they can, not have to worry about finances and can at least commit to finishing their high school education. So yeah, I mean, our mission is to serve everyone equally, regardless of creed, background, religion, etc., which can be a challenge, especially when we have, we resettle Rohingya and Karen and Burmese people and potentially have them all in the same classrooms. Overall, all the departments are working to increase their self-sufficiency and teach them to advocate for themselves and how to navigate, the American bureaucracy, because it's usually quite different from where they come from.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the the self-sufficiency piece, it's almost like a teach a man to fish sort of thing, where it's just really good to have them break into this new environment and make them a little bit more comfortable so they can proceed in the best way.
And honestly, a lot of it with self-sufficiency is not that they lack the skills, because a lot of times they don't. They just have to get comfortable navigating and understanding our systems here. But really, oftentimes it just comes down to confidence. And a lot of the time it's because of language or lack of language access, or a nervousness about advocating for, the use of translators, which they're completely legally entitled to, especially when they're dealing with government agencies like Department of Social Services, and certainly with immigration. But, if you've experienced persecution from your government or, other authorities, it can be very hard just to learn to self-advocate and say, like, no, I'm not comfortable doing this appointment without an interpreter present. So that's like one of the biggest pieces, honestly, is just building up their confidence enough to say, like, no, like, you don't have anything to fear. You can do this. And honestly, we usually start by like modeling that and showing them how to do it with them. And then, being there while they do it. And then eventually they do it while we're not there. But we're around as resource people if they need it. So a lot of it just comes down to confidence and just being comfortable learning the new system, which honestly it takes longer than the initial 90 days. So I don't know if you're aware that all resettlement agencies really get funding to support our individuals that we resettle for 90 days. And then post 90 days, they're expected to do almost everything on their own, which is really tough.
Yeah, I can imagine. I feel like in a community like Buffalo too, where there's a very large refugee population, it would just be really nice to sort of have that group support as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of really strong community leaders. So people who've been here for a long time, and they've worked out some like really amazing support systems to support their own community. Like there's informal banking where you can like request a loan from the Eritrean community leaders to start a business or buy a house. So that is one of the benefits for sure of being a refugee resettlement center as a city. Almost everyone we're resettling, they will eventually find a home within the broader community here, and people that can mentor them and help them navigate in the ways that they've already learned to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you already mentioned that language instruction is a very big part of the MAC program. But I was wondering if you could give it like a more general overview of some of the stuff you do aside from the language piece.
Yeah, so the MAC program is different from the rest of our education programs only because it's a task preparation program in essence. However, we try and structure it as much like a traditional high school as possible because its goal, the reason it started was we resettle a lot of even like 16 and up. Depending on where they are in terms of their English language acquisition, they may or may not be able to, successfully acquire all of the English necessary to pass the Regents and get their traditional high school diploma. So the MAC program that's why we say we structure it as much like a high school. Pre-COVID, we do field trips. And part of it is also to introduce them to the community. So that's the goal of the field trips too, is not like traditional high school field trips, a lot of it is like, taking them down to the waterfront park and showing them like free resources and fun things that they can do in the community, as well as the more traditional, like going to the theater and going to the art gallery type stuff. So it's a heavy emphasis, obviously, on English acquisition. Typically, so right now, our lower level students are in our regular English classes because of the remote education, but typically in our seated classes, we have 4 levels at MAC. The level 1 and 2, they tend to be pre-literate in their native languages, as well as level 1 would have pretty much no English. Level 2, maybe some like emergent basic sentences, greetings, that type of thing. And they may have some emerging literacy, and they're more likely to have written literacy in their own native language, depending on where they come from. And then level 3 and 4 is more, it's described level 3 as more like 8th grade through early high school. And then level 4, they're really, they're writing almost college level essays, and they're really like making that final push to sit for the task exam, which is, honestly, I don't know if I could pass it. And I taught in the program before I took over running the program. And honestly, I don't know if a lot of Westerners would be able to pass it. It's just like cramming, 12 years of education into 2 days worth of testing. So it's a pretty intense program to prep for. And most of our students do really well. If they don't pass it the first time, they usually pass it the second time. The biggest areas of difficulty are almost always reading and writing, especially now that during the pandemic, the writing used to be handwritten, which our students prefer, because even though they're really great on their devices, like their phones, a lot of them don't have typing skills, which is not unique to our population. My partner is a college teacher and he sees that all the time too. Like downloading a Word document is somehow mystifying, but like make a TikTok video and it's all good. So now the task test, the written portion, which is writing a full length essay, is all typing on the computer. So that's been a little bit trickier. We just had one student, she wasn't sure that she passed, but she did pass. She has to sit for the reading portion because she missed it by 5 points, which is terrible. But that's fairly common, just because it is really high level vocabulary. So it can take a couple runs at it to get comfortable with the reading and writing. It differs. The level 1 and 2, it's really focused heavily on immersive English language acquisition. We do allow the students, of course, to use their native languages, and they will obviously naturally group themselves amongst their native languages with peers. And so they often support each other in their home languages, which sometimes in the past we've had teachers who didn't really like allowing that. But I find, because a lot of our students come from a collectivist society, it's just better to allow them to work together naturally, because you're fighting an uphill battle to try and get them not to. But, I've had teachers who think that the way that they like share information and teach each other is cheating, because from a Western perspective, we're so individualized in our methods of instruction. So it kind of takes a bit of a mind shift to understand like the collectivist approach is like, if I know the answer, then you need to know the answer too. It's not cheating. It's just bringing your community with you when you get something. So yeah, level 1 and 2 is really just focused on the basic literacy, making sure they understand the basic tenses and can communicate well verbally, a lot of conversation-based stuff. And they help them with a lot of life-based stuff too. Like this time of year, we often get notices and they think they owe taxes. They'll get like their check from the IRS. They think they have to, it's like some bill they have to pay. So a lot of the life skills also come in level 1 and 2. And then upper level 2, we begin teaching like social studies and science, but it is like through the lens of language acquisition. So perhaps they'll read, like something that's at like a 2nd grade level, but it happens to be about a topic that would relate to like geography, for example. So that's how we start to weave in a very like cross-curricular way. They also do basic math right from level 1 and 2. So that by the time they're in level 3, they're really doing like middle school math, because the math on the task exam is pretty intense. And then by level 3 and 4, they're taking all regular classes. Normally it would be like a big block of reading and writing in the morning, then either science or social studies, and then math in the afternoon. Now our schedule's all kind of mixed up because it's all being done on Zoom, but they're still getting all of those content areas. And then they'll also do, they have like study group and office hours where they can, just pop in if they're having trouble with something from the lesson, and have some one-on-one time with the teacher.
Awesome. I think it's actually really incredible how it's structured that well. I'm impressed by that. I was wondering, what's like the typical time frame where you would see a student jump from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4?
There is no typical time frame. It really is dependent on, the student's background. We use the term SIFE, or sometimes it's SLIFE, student with interrupted or limited formal education. So if you have not had education, say, since like second grade, and, you're now 16, it's going to be a much harder uphill battle for you. Whereas, we've had many students who like came from Syria, who were in one in particular, who was like in an engineering university program when they had to flee, but they did not, unfortunately, have their high school diploma with them. So they had to get the task exam. But, it's not uncommon in Syria, especially if you're from one of the city centers, to speak 3 different languages. They sometimes even learn an Asiatic language. So most of them have English, Arabic, and French already. So if you come with that foundation, you probably would actually test right into like a level 3. And if you come from a community where, it's pre-literate, like a lot of our Swahili speakers, they just, and some of our Karen speakers too, they just have more of an emphasis on being in an oral culture instead of written, then that is different, because you have to transition to our very heavily based, literacy-based society. So that can be tricky. They say that statistically 5 to 7 years is the average to acquire the English required to pass high school, which would include the task. But that, I think, is optimistic, because that's not taking into account, other life pressures, trauma. Because we do see trauma impacts our students' ability to learn a lot of times. So that's one thing that is really tricky for us. Sometimes it's really hard to differentiate between what might be a learning disability and what might be the effect of trauma and its impact on learning or inability to learn something. Likewise, we get some, I say behavioral problems, but like they're really not what typical behavior problems would be in a classroom. But just, sometimes what you think is like a teenage attitude is actually like that resistance that you're seeing is trauma, and they're testing limits like to find out if they can trust you. So really that 5 to 7 year range, I think, is in ideal circumstances. If they don't have to leave school, if they don't have to work 5 hours every night after class, and they have time to really like focus on their education.
Yeah, I guess that would make a lot of sense. It considers a number of factors in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a question that our funders always want. And I'm always like, I'm sorry, you're not gonna like my answer, because I don't have a great one. Like, I want to be honest with you. Because of course a funder would love to say like, hey, can I, like, how much is it gonna cost to like sponsor someone for 5 years? And at the end of the 5 years, will they have their task? Like, I can't promise you that. We hope, of course.
Yeah, especially just because like the legislative process that goes into funding requires very straightforward, hard answers.
It does, yeah.
So I can see how that would be a little bit tricky. I guess in a similar to this question, who would you say benefits the most from going through the MAC program in terms of maybe age, ethnicity, or particular groups?
I would say definitely, students who have encountered trauma, and definitely the students who are in that SIFE category. So, have interrupted education, or maybe just really minimal access to education. Because also, the one commonality that we have amongst our students, even though they may be from, all over the place, and our demographics they're changing a lot right now with thankfully, with getting rid of the Muslim ban. So it really depends on what's happening politically, which demographics we see.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those students that have encountered more trauma, I think they do better in our program, because they have that shared background with everyone in our program. They already know, like, you're a refugee or an immigrant. So you, at least even if you didn't flee, say, a war-torn country in the same way that like a Syrian kid may have, because a lot of our Congolese, for example, might, a lot of them have been actually raised in refugee camps. So they didn't necessarily encounter, violence firsthand, whereas, Syrian kids more than likely have. but they have this like initial understanding and commonality in that, you know, they're on a completely different side of the world trying to make a life for themselves. They're total fish out of water. They're learning the language. And honestly, just the resettlement process itself is often, unfortunately, traumatizing. So even if you weren't like traumatized in your home country specifically, just going through that process, it's so invasive. I mean, it's a 3-hour long interview to be deemed a refugee, and you have to relive all of the most horrendous things that have ever happened to you. So, I mean, that is very traumatizing. And I myself, I'm an immigrant, so I know, and I mean, I came from Canada, so it's not like I have a super traumatic background or anything, but my immigration experience even was traumatizing. So I think that's the nice thing is like, nobody's weird in the classroom. Like, you know, if you see scars or if you see the like startle reflex, which we often see because we're in an old factory building, it can be kind of loud sometimes. So nobody thinks you're weird if you have like obvious signs of trauma. Nobody thinks it's weird if you're like, you know, I stopped going to school at, you know, age 7. So I think just that that like community, that sense of community that we offer them, I think is the most important because a lot of them just need a safe space. And I think sometimes that's even more valuable than actually successfully getting the task, is just having that safe place so that they can, you know, really figure out what their place in this new community is going to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I actually did some research into the immigration process and totally agree that the interview portion of it is just so invasive. And the fact
it's awful.
Like a professional has to uncover what happened is like, I have my own reserves about that. We don't get into it.
Yeah. I mean, and the stories that they hear, and I mean, we have a huge immigration legal department. And so we have a lot of asylees and people who, you know, same thing. They have to sit and tell their most horrendous stories to our attorneys so that our attorneys can make a solid case for asylum for them. And so, I mean, I often talk to our attorneys about just like the secondary trauma that they experience in hearing these horrendous stories. And then, you know, sometimes having to sit them down and say, your case for asylum was denied and you're now, you know, on the list to be deported. I mean, it's horrible. So it's horrible for the client, and it's definitely horrible for the people that are conducting the interviews, because I do, despite my own experiences with immigration, I do believe that most people who work in this world are in it for the right reasons and are compassionate people. Yeah.
So in a similar vein, aside from the process, like what kind of barriers do you see this population typically face in attempting to access higher education specifically, aside from the test, I suppose?
I think a lot of it is really financial. So I think that would be our biggest reason for attrition in our program, and also the biggest reason why they stop before going on to post-secondary. Especially there's a lot of responsibility placed on the eldest children in a family, especially, you know, it's not uncommon, especially for like our Congolese or Somali families, to have like 6 or 8 kids. And so if you are like an 18-year-old and you have a 5-year-old sibling and a whole bunch in between you and them, it's often expected that, you know, the eldest 2, sometimes 3 children will also go to work along with the parents. And so that can be really difficult to help the family understand that even if you're not getting as much money being on social assistance, like you will make so much more money in the long run if you're able to even get an associate's degree. And so we do a lot of like trying to convince them just to, you know, make that short-term investment, but it's really tough when you're like barely surviving. I mean, the benefits that they get are abysmal. So that's probably the biggest one. Yeah, typically if they do transition into, we have a Pathways partnership program that is one of our biggest funders. And so they go directly from us to our local community college, which is Erie County Community College. And we have an ESL case manager who does their intake. He'll give them their tests, their AccuPlacer tests for English and math. And then he will advise them, help them pick their courses and give them additional support. So that's a nice partnership that we have. And Mike, our case manager at the college, he used to work for Journey's End. So he's very familiar with our clients. And he actually started, just like I did, started teaching in the MAC program. Then he ran the MAC program, and then he transitioned to ECC. So he's very well steeped in, you know, the needs that they have the uphill battle that they've already climbed in order to be able to even, consider applying for the 2-year program. But we encourage them always to start a 2-year program, even if they, want to go into pre-med or whatever and go to a 4-year school, just because I think a lot of them at first have a lot of trouble transitioning from our program, which is like, we work hard to create that safe space. We do a lot of hand holding. We provide all these wraparound services, and we'll help them with anything. And so to go from that, where, if you don't show up for class, your teacher's going to call you, right? To go from that to like the very like individualized, like total responsibilities all on you at college can be quite shocking. So I think, having Mike as a case manager so that they know they have that one friendly face, at least, that they can always go and talk to, that really helps. So I think also the other barrier would be like just learning how to navigate the bureaucracy of higher education, and like, what is FAFSA, and like, what are these, like, are these loans? Like, how do you deal with financial aid? What happens if you fail classes? And the fact that you can, be denied financial aid. So we do our MAC, our high level MAC teacher, Ian, he does a lot of assistance with applying to college. He does a lot of like soft skills and just like tries to prepare them for the independence that's required, and the intrinsic motivation that they will need. And also just like how to advocate, like if you're having trouble, like you need to contact your professor, because if you don't show up to class, it's not like being at the MAC program where we're going to call you and be like, hey, are you okay? You might not show up all month and they don't care. Exactly. So we try and do what we can, but it is still for a lot of them a wake up call once they get there.
Yeah, but I totally agree that as long as you do everything in your power to make that transition as smooth as possible, then I'm sure that's incredibly helpful. So,
well, and a lot of them are very motivated to go to higher education. Like they're like almost can't stand the fact that they have to sit and write the task exam, because they're just like so ready for the next level, especially those who were in higher education already and then had to take a step back. It feels like their whole life has been on pause. So we try and help them get there as fast as possible.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's great. So I guess aside from maybe going through level 4 of the program, how would you determine the student's ready for the TASC exam, task exam?
Yeah, so we use kind of the adult education standard, which is the TABE test. It's the test to assess adult basic education. It's a written test. So when they come to our offices in a pre-pandemic time, they would come to our offices on a Friday, and we would assess them. If they're very low level English, we give them a computer-based linguistic test. It's just an oral test. For our lower level, it's scored basically from 0 to 10. And if you're from like 8 through 10, then you would transition to the TABE, which is written. Although it's not a great transition, because just because you can speak really well doesn't mean you can read and write. Mm-hmm. So it's not great, but that's what New York State funders want. So they would write the task exam. The TABE exam. There's multiple levels. So we use what's called a locator, which is just like a sampling of questions to find their basic level. That tells us which book they need, because it starts with E, which is not for easy, but I always remember it as being easy, and goes all the way up to the one that would be the closest and the best predictor of task success. So they would take those tests in a normal reality. All of our assessments are waived right now, but in a normal seated class time, once a semester, they take those tests. And ideally, you see educational gains being made every semester. And then once they're working in the hardest book, that's the point at which it's basically, because our classes are very small and they get a lot of individualized instruction, Ian, their teacher, will say to them, okay, I think you're ready. Let's give you, say, the social studies practice exam. And the practice exam is actually made up of questions that are no longer on the task exam. So it's a very good predictor of success. That's how we decide. We do often have students. We have one student right now who he really, really, really wants to write the task, but he's just not ready. So we will also sometimes give them the task practice test to kind of help them see where they are, without having to crush all of their hopes and dreams by just saying you're not ready. Like, just let them take the test and then they can assess themselves and see like, okay, if I'm only at a 50% success rate with the practice test, then I probably need to devote some more time. But yeah, usually by the time our students go and actually Ian recommends them, it's a fairly involved process too, in order to refer someone. So we don't do the task exams at our location, but the University of Buffalo Educational Opportunity Center, which is in downtown Buffalo and fairly close to us, they test the students for us. But it's a fairly involved, you have to apply. You have to show that the student has been given practice tests, and they have to have a sworn letter from an attorney that they are who they say they are, and ID. And so we don't just send anybody. Also, it makes our program look bad if we're sending people consistently that don't do well. And it's stressful for the student. It's 2 full days of testing, 2 full 6 to 8 hour days. So it's a big deal for them. But by the time we actually send someone, we've never had anybody just fail all portions. Sometimes it's taken 3 goes at it to successfully pass everything, because there's 2 math portions, science, social studies, and a reading and a writing. So it's a lot. But the good news is if you pass part, they will keep that part, and then you can just focus on the sections that you haven't passed. So it's not like you have to write the entire thing all over again. So the student who passed everything except reading by 5 points, there's a 60-day remediation period, they call it, where you can't sit for it again. But then after that, she can go, and as long as she passes the reading, the whole thing is done and she'll get her certification.
Wow. Yeah, as long as they have the motivation too, I'm sure they don't mind taking the test a couple times around.
No, and honestly, usually by the second time, if they're going back, it's easier for them. And I don't even know if it's because they've spent the time and actually focused on the skills that they needed to, or there's just so much less anxiety because they know what to expect. They've already done it, and they can just relax a little bit. Because I honestly the test anxiety and how much weight and emphasis they and their families put on them when they sit for this exam, I think that is actually probably one of the worst parts of the process.
Yeah, no, test anxiety is totally a universal feeling. I understand that completely.
Yeah, I mean, I had really high test anxiety too, and I have multiple university degrees, and I never really got over it. So it happens to everybody, I guess.
Exactly. And then question 6 has already been answered pretty well, so we can skip right ahead to 7. So I was wondering, what are your strategies to sort of build a sense of kinship or a relationship between instructor and student in the MAC program?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I'm the most proud of with all of our teachers is they take that emphasis that we have on building a rapport really seriously. And that more than anything else is what we strive to establish right off the bat. So from the very first time they walk in our doors and say they want to come to our classes, they're meeting with a teacher. So a teacher or myself will conduct an intake and get to know them. We do a fairly lengthy intake that goes into their educational background, what their goals are, what their long-term goals are in terms of if they have career aspirations in one way or another. And we also talk fairly at length about, their past educational experiences, what they liked, what they didn't like, challenges. Sometimes it comes out that they will talk a little bit about some of the trauma at that point, but usually that happens a little bit later. So right off the bat, they're investing in the student and trying to find out what individually makes that student tick and what their goals are. And I think that's the beauty of our program being relatively small, especially the MAC program. It's smaller than our adult classes. They get individualized attention. So, if the teacher knows that this one student is really interested in, we had one student who's really obsessed with Bob Marley. So he can weave things like that into the lesson because this kid was super musical and used to perform at all of our assemblies and stuff. So it's easier, I think, to build that rapport when you have a much smaller class. And Ian especially takes time constantly. I finally have convinced him to turn his phone off on the weekends so that he doesn't answer student calls on weekends. But it's that level of dedication that he has to them if they call him out of hours, panicking, which they often do, if they get a letter that they don't understand, or they're just now, especially some of them have had COVID and called us, and a lot of them have food insecurity. So I'm going to be spending my entire afternoon driving around. Our food pantry is now mobile in the real sense of mobile because we're all driving. We will be driving and delivering 150 boxes of food to our clients and individuals this afternoon. So, I mean, even like that level of support. So I think that also helps, is that it's not just their education that we're interested in. We're interested in their ability to thrive in all areas of their life. And they know that there's nothing that's off limits, that they can come and talk to us about anything. We also hold a lot of like workshops that are targeted to subjects that they really need additional information on. So like right now, there's a Burmese language workshop happening virtually right now on scams. And like there's a lot of IRS scams and like COVID related scams that are going on. And we see, unfortunately, a lot of refugees within the refugee community scamming their own communities, which is pretty horrific. So we do a lot of workshops. I mean, we've even done like sex education workshops, because we went through like a year period where like every other female in the program was getting pregnant. And so it was really important for us to just provide a safe place for them to talk about that sort of thing. And the fact that like now that they're here, yes, I know it's like maybe the norm by like 18 to be married and be having kids, in Congo, but here you have choices. You don't have to do that. If you want to, more power to you, wonderful, but it's a choice, and you can choose, to have romantic or sexual relationships, and you can also be in charge of your own, contraception use and stuff. So we really work on like supporting the whole individual and not just their education and their educational goals. So I think, and they do a lot of like really goofy things. Like they just play a lot of games. All of our teachers, not just the MAC program, willingly make fools of themselves, probably on a daily basis, playing games with them. And, the field trips and stuff, and just knowing that they can come and talk to us. Even myself, like I would be walking around. We have a whole like school section of our offices that are separate from the administrative side. And, every break time, lunchtime, in the morning when they're arriving, and in the afternoon when they're leaving, I'm around so they can access me. They know that they can always come in, and my office door is always open for them as well. So I think just the accessibility, and like, because the program is small, we can really get to know them and their needs, and also extend those services to their families as well, because they can't possibly be thriving if, their mother is struggling, and that's draining their ability to focus on school as well.
Yeah.
So it takes time. It definitely takes time. But we work hard to build that trust.
Yeah, that's something I gathered from the interview with Paige as well. There's just so much passion in either the mentors or the instructors in this program. I really respect that. I was impressed.
Well, working in the not-for-profit, you're not going to like make $1 million probably ever. So you really do have to be passionate about it. And that's everyone in my department. They're 150% committed. And that's the most important thing, because you can't teach the passion. If you have that, I can teach you anything else. You just have to have that passion and compassion. It really does take a different type of attitude. We have had teachers in the past that are no longer with the program that, kind of there's a attitude out there amongst not just educators, but in the refugee resettlement community at large that, it's almost like a white savior complex. Like these people are coming here and they have all these deficits, and it's almost treated like a disability. I mean, it's very telling that like the MAC program, our funding is now what funds the RAMP program. They switched it, but that is funded by the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. That tells you right there how they view being a refugee, right? Or learning an additional language it's a disability, it's a deficit. And so we work really hard to reposition that, reframe it as it's an asset. Look at the assets that they come with. Yeah, they might not speak English, but do you speak 10 languages? Because I have like at least 15 students that do, right? So that's a huge asset. Like you're that multilingual, like let's get you, a job after class as an interpreter, because we have an interpreting department. So just really like reframing that as the assets that they have, because also, many of them have been to more countries than I have ever been to. They've seen more than I could ever hope to see in their short lives already. So they really do come with a lot of skills that are transferable. And we've worked hard to build a department that really values their background and their assets that they bring to the table, because we can learn from them. I learn from my students constantly, and their resiliency, I think, that's the piece that makes everyone, I think, hooks everyone in and keeps you coming back. Is like, you'd think hearing all these horrible stories is like, brings you down, but no, what you see and learn from these students is that like the power of the human spirit to overcome and build back anew is just, I don't know, that's the addicting part. You get addicted to seeing how successful they can be and how like strong they are. Yeah. And it makes me never, ever complain about anything in my life. I'm like, look at what you've been through and you're not complaining. You're smiling every day. Like they really are, it's cheesy, but they really are inspirational in their resiliency.
Wow. That was actually what the research I mentioned earlier was on, the way to bypass savior complex. So hearing like a real life workable explanation of that is incredible. So thank you for that. So we also kind of already touched on this, but we can maybe put it a little bit more under the microscope. So what's like the gradual progression you would say from like a level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to level 4? Like I know you mentioned there's some exams and there's some like pre-tests, but how would you move a student from like level 1 to 2 or 2 to 3?
Yeah, a lot of it is based on testing, but we definitely have students where, they test into the next level, but we know that they're actually not really ready. They're testing into that level because, they've been given accommodations that help boost that test result, for example. And especially like the oral linguistic test that we do, our lower level teachers teach the first 5 questions of that test. So you can have a conversation with me and say like, where are you from? How long have you lived in the United States? And you can verbatim like spit out the answers to those first 5 questions, but do you comprehend them? Those are 2 different things. So we definitely have students that test higher than the level that we keep them in, which is, again, we're really lucky with the way our funding works because they don't tell us how we have to structure the program. So we've structured the program in the way that we think most benefits the students, which gives us the flexibility to, keep a student or even move a student up, even if they didn't technically test in. Maybe we know that they have really bad test anxiety and that the test isn't indicative of their actual skill set. So we have a lot of flexibility, thankfully, within the program. Honestly, moving up from level 1 to level 2 also has a lot to do with behavioral things and just like comfort, especially our students that are SIFE students or some of them who've never been to school before. A lot of level 1 is like learning how to be a student, because like even the concept of like raising a hand or like not just getting up and leaving the classroom without telling the instructor where you're going, those are concepts that actually have to be taught. Things that we take for granted, those of us who've been educated in the Western world, because it was like drilled into us, even before we went to school, our families were preparing us for that. And then also like, some of our students who have had schooling, they have to learn our approach to schooling. Like it's very common for us to ask for them for their opinion on something, and they just stare at us like, what? Because they're not usually asked for their opinion. Even in like, extremely educated countries like Syria, opinion is not something that is valued from the student side. And so that's a shift that they have to make. And that's one of the hardest pieces of like getting ready for university level writing is like most essays are opinion, right? Choose an argument, argue for that, and then that's your opinion. So we do a lot of debating and a lot of like emphasis on opinion. So from level 1 to 2, a lot of it is just showing that they're comfortable, they've adapted to classroom life, and that they have that foundational skill set. By the end of level 1, they're writing sentences. And also the way our program works is they could stay in, say, level 1 for reading, but then move up to level 2 for writing. And they might even be in level 3 or 4 for math if they just happen to be like someone who's really good at math. So we have that flexibility as well. So it's not uncommon for them to be at multiple levels. So it's not just the test that helps us decide. At the end of every semester in a seated reality, on a Friday when we have no students, all of the teachers would meet once all the TABE tests have been done and graded, and we look over all their scores. And that's when we decide who's leveling up, who should stay. Do we need to readjust our levels? Because sometimes we do that. So we have a basic score guideline for each level, but sometimes we've had to change those because we have a bunch of students that are, just not quite scoring into that. And so again, we have a lot of flexibility with that. So we literally sit down and just look at all the scores. We try and make the classes also as balanced numerically as possible, not only just with skills, but just like we don't want to have a class of 20 and then a class of 10. So it's a collective decision that all of the teachers and myself make together. And it's a very individual decision.
Yeah, I think that's great. So this is kind of the question we feel the need to like ask everyone because it's such a pressing issue for what we deal with. So how do you feel higher education institutions can make that transition a little bit easier for refugee populations?
I think obviously cultural competency is having a moment right now. And I think that that is really super important. So I think that kind of goes back to that, like that assets mentality of, yes, they may not have traditional Western educational experience. Yes, their English may be, you know, a little choppy here and there, and they may have trouble expressing an opinion sometimes, but you know, what else do they bring to the table? So I think just like, and also just understanding something like as simple as like the collectivist approach to things. If you understand it, then maybe you can adapt your own classroom instruction, even if you're talking on a larger scale, like in post-secondary, because honestly, after working with students from like a collective mindset, like they bring a lot to the table, and you can really, as an educator, you can really utilize that, have them teach each other. I mean, learning like peer-to-peer instruction is really powerful. And that approach that they have is like perfect for it. It's so I think just an understanding, and also just I think some sensitivity training would also be really helpful, you know, like what they may have been through, just so that you're aware, like if they're nervous about advocating for themselves or contacting their instructor, like what might the reason be, right? Is it because they fear authority, or because their teachers in their home country were like super authoritarian and it wasn't okay to ask a question or ask for an extension? Or so I think some cultural awareness and sensitivity training I think would go a long way, because I know, as I mentioned, my partner teaches at the community college that we are affiliated with, and they get like no training on what to do with an English as an additional language student. And all of his like, you know, trauma training is like from me saying like he'll read me an email, and I was right away, I'm like, well, that's an English language learner, so that's why they're having that trouble. Like, but they don't even get that. So yeah, I think a lot more just awareness of, and also awareness of the barriers that they face, because most of our students, even when they go to university, you know, they're working, potentially going home and helping babysit the, you know, large numbers of siblings. Females are usually helping cook and clean. So there's a lot of those traditional gender roles that are expected of them. And I think whenever possible, I think it would be really helpful to have a similar situation like we have, like having a devoted case manager at the college who can just, you know, act as their advisor, help them navigate the bureaucracy, and just kind of be that friendly face and someone that they know they can rely on, who can help them just adapt and learn. Because it is, you know, I don't know, I still maintain in my undergraduate degree, I think I learned more about life, you know, and just like living in a dorm and like living away from home and like how to pay bills on your own. Like, I think you learn more about life and navigating bureaucracy, or at least almost as much as you do inside the classroom. So having someone to help hold their hand a little bit, and be that friendly face, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, it's almost,
and that person could also be if like help facilitate trainings, you know, and teach instructors, and like here, you know, teach them about cultural awareness, because there's a serious lack of cultural awareness even in places like Buffalo, where we have a lot of refugees. Like, a lot of people don't know that like we have, you know, the Somali Bantu here, and then other Somalis from different tribes that really look down on Somali Bantu. And so if you're going to have the two of them in the same program and classroom, what might that look like? How do you build a safe place when literally like their people were killing each other in their home countries? Because a lot of people are not aware of just those basic things, which can completely destroy your ability to build a safe community of learners.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like operating within the paradigm of the people that are coming in is such a beneficial idea that it's totally underutilized. I guess while we're on the subject of challenges that come up and ways to maybe work around them, have you guys had any sort of like major challenges, maybe crises or anything of the like with the MAC program? Maybe like COVID or that sort of thing?
This was one of the craziest things I've had to navigate, certainly. Most of our students don't have a strong technological background. Like I said before, that like they can use their phone. Most of them use WhatsApp because you don't need data for that. And so they use it to communicate internationally with their friends and family abroad. But other than that, they've had to learn like our Mac classes. They use Zoom and then Google Classroom and a couple other like Doc Hub to upload things. But all of those had to be like explicitly taught. We are lucky that we have a small number of class laptops that we've been able to lend out to some of our students who didn't have devices because, especially if you're in level 3 or 4 in the Mac program or our advanced adult English class, you need a laptop so that you can type, because to type like a college level essay on your phone is just, I wouldn't do it. So I couldn't expect our students to. So a lot of it has been teaching the skills, getting the devices out there, helping them connect with reasonably priced internet services. And yeah, I mean, honestly, our teachers, every time we get a new student, I would say it's not uncommon for our teachers to spend half hour to an hour just getting them used to the tech platforms. If they're using one of our laptops, we can like take over remote control of their laptop and like show them by taking over and how to open a Zoom link, etc. But it's really tough. Like our beginner adult classes, we have 60 students in the 2 different classes right now, but I would say only 20 of them are online. So the vast majority of them are actually getting packets of like hard copy lessons that the teachers deliver once a month. So in our advanced Mac class and our advanced adult English classes, they're the only ones that are not getting paper. So a lot of our teachers are also using a combination of online and paper. So they'll get the paper worksheets and then they'll do them online on Zoom with the teacher supporting them. So it's been really tricky, and it's taken a lot of different allocation of time and resources in the department. So, because our students live all over, so it's not uncommon that it would take 3 days to get all of the lessons out to one class. So yeah, it's been tricky. We've been applying for more funding, and we've been fairly successful getting funding just to get more devices. And we're looking at, there's a program out of Albany that we're looking at right now, and potentially writing a grant to partner with them. And it's called Albany Can Code. So they teach like coding and much higher level stuff, but they also have a basic tech literacy class. And so we're looking at partnering with them so that we can get more and more students online, because that's the other thing that we've learned is not only is it important for their learning right now, but it's an important life skill for once they leave us and go on to wherever. I mean, even if you're working as a cashier or somewhere out in the community in a store, chances are you're using a computer now, right? Like you're not using an old school cash register the way like I was when I was a cashier. Like, so it's really a life skill that we've learned. Okay, this is a deficit that we had in our program previously. And so it has helped us actually to figure out we need to bring in more computer stuff to the class.
Yeah, especially in a post-COVID world, those skills are going to be even more essential, because now we've had that
Absolutely
fully remote education.
Yeah, and it's not great. I wouldn't do super well with it. Like I definitely was one of those people that never took online classes throughout my university career. Like I was the loser that was always in like the front row, wanted to talk to my professor. Like I just really wanted to engage with like my education in a way that isn't really possible online. And so I think that's been particularly hard for not just, our English language learners really do benefit from in-person hands-on instruction, but just for the people that just don't learn well in this like two-dimensional, our kinesthetic learners. And it's been tough. But then others have thrived. We've also had some students, it's not uncommon for us to have people with injuries and health challenges that come from the situation that they were fleeing. And so like we had one woman who she's waiting to get back surgery right now, but she was in so much pain that it was really hard for her to come to class, but she can totally hop on a Zoom. And so now we're also exploring like, how do we continue to offer that type of access once we go back to seated? And so several of our teachers are considering like looking at, can they broadcast their class via Zoom so that the students who can't physically come to the office can still participate? So, that's the silver lining, is that we've learned some things that we will definitely adapt and build into our program moving forward.
I think that's great. Just to close up here, we can ask one final question. What do you think the student body themselves could do to make higher education institutions a little bit more accessible?
As in like university student body?
As in, yeah, the university student body.
I think it kind of is similar to what I said about the instructors and on the staff level, is just like cultural awareness and creating a welcoming, diverse, and inclusive student community. I think also continuing to ensure that, you know, higher education is accessible to all and that it is diverse and represents what America looks like, so that you're not, as a Congolese student, walking into a classroom, you know, 50 undergrads that are all white, because, you know, even in, you know, my education, I went to one of the bigger universities in Canada for my education degree. It's like, you know, it's a lot of, even though Toronto is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, it's a lot of wealthy, you know, upper middle class, white kids that came from families that have already, you know, their families have been educated and know how to navigate that system. So just making sure that, and I mean, that's not something the student body can do. That's more of at a community level, and something that all the universities need to take on to just make it accessible, and something that we need the government to help do with funding. But yeah, I think just finding ways to make the learning community just more inclusive and more representative of the multicultural society that we live in now in the United States. Even if it's things like, you know, understanding, like if students are, you know, fasting during Ramadan, like they might excuse themselves from class. I know I went to school with a large number of Muslim people, and so it wasn't uncommon for, once the sun went down, for them to leave the classroom and go and eat. So just like having an awareness of like what's happening when suddenly, you know, all of the Muslim students get up and leave because it's sunset and they can now eat. Because we don't, unfortunately, and this maybe is something we need to teach at lower levels too, we don't often teach those things before they get to higher education, where it should be totally normal, right? Like if I know about Christmas, then why don't I also know about Ramadan? Just to normalize that so they don't feel like they have to explain themselves, I think would also be really useful. I don't know. I think everyone in the like diversity and inclusion offices needs to like, they need more funding so that they can really focus on this and not just like head nods and lip service to like inclusion, which I think is what's been a lot of what's been going on. And hopefully that's one of the benefits of, you know, this intensity of the Black Lives Matter movement that came out and started last summer. Maybe there will be more funding and more, just place more value on that work, because I think it is really important. And ultimately have a more diverse set of instructors. The instructors should also reflect what the student body should look like, right? And have people from all over, and maybe even like increasing, you know, visiting professorships, have visiting professors, you know, from various African countries come over too, because it would be really nice for our refugee students to see themselves reflected in the instructors.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that would be absolutely incredible. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. I had a good time talking with you. So
yeah, no, it's been great.